let's back up to their transformation frameworks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we can apply them to anything where we're building new. But so often we hear EDI just kind of limited to this people and culture space or this HR space. But when I think about the principle and what goes into the principle are a certain set of frameworks, which could be trauma-informed framework, an intersectional framework, or an approach, gender-based violence approach, anti-racism, anti-oppression. All of those frameworks are used to uphold EDI and be able to live into those principles.
Okay. And so how'd you come to this work? What brought you into the DEI space? Maybe let's back up a little bit. Mm-hmm. What is your work? Well, how do you see yourself, or how have you worked in this DEI space to bring about transformational change for organizations or for systems? What does that role look like for you, and how did it come to be?
How it came to be. I think for many of us in that EDI space, it's like a spark of lived experience. And the spark ignited when I was in my undergrad. I think like many of us, my undergrad is in political science and social justice, and so I was a social justice warrior. But it was the first time that I had experienced and was able to contextualize working in a system that actually wasn't built for me, an institution actually. University was hard. It was so hard being a first generation, Black, young, being away from home, all the things that intersected to impact my experience. But I joined a sorority, the first and only, I think at the time it was only Black sorority. And that was actually the first time where I experienced Black women who were also social justice warriors. And they taught me well. And so at first, I went in with the intention to become a social worker. And I noticed in our conversations, we kind of bonded on that, I didn't really like the person-to-person. So I then took a political science class, and I was like, yep, this is what I love. This is what I prefer to do. Systems, structures, policy. I felt that was more my speed, more my interest, and then compiling it that with like the social justice lens. So that's how it all started.
Okay. So many questions. What was one thing that you learned from those other Black women in the sorority that has stuck with you, or that was one of those kind of light bulb moments where it's like, oh, that's a different way of being or approaching something or viewing something?
Duality, the multifacetedness. I don't know if that's a word.
It is now.
It is now. But that I could be so many different things, right? We could listen to trap music, but then we could have really, really deep and intellectual conversations around anti-oppression, anti-racism. We can root our experiences and our intelligence and our lived experience. So if anything, that's what really paved my way and my direction in the work, because it taught me to be unapologetic and gave me the confidence. Because a lot of times when I walk into a room, I don't see people that look like me. But I know there are people that look like me in those spaces. And so, yeah. Hope that answers your question.
No, it's great. I love that. And duality is an interesting one. And we could probably just go down that rabbit hole of how that needs to show up in the world more than it does. We tend to get very binary in our thinking, very right and wrong, very
you have to be
good,
one
bad,
way.
one way to do something. I think that shows up a lot in our organizations. You see that when you start to read policies, it's like there's an assumption underneath of all of that everyone cares about the same thing or values the same things, views the world a certain way. And we could talk about why that exists, how systems get created and the power structures inherent with them. I'm sure we'll dig into some of that in the podcast today. I'm excited for that conversation. Let's keep on the journey path a little bit. And so you shift gears from kind of a social worker focus to political science. And then what happens? What was some of your experiences along the way, punctuation marks where you look at and say, that was a really meaningful turning point or validation that I was on the right path?
So after I started my career in healthcare and education, so working for an age service organization. And so I would work on behalf of priority populations that are most vulnerable to HIV/AIDS. So in addition to working with and for women and non-binary folks who identify with having HIV/AIDS, I'd work with different populations from African Caribbean Black women, who were experiencing violence, women who were identified as drug users, sex workers. I think I captured most of them. But in that work, I would work with organizations, agencies, nonprofit, public, private, and I would work with them to figure out how can we incorporate, or how can they improve their services, their programs, their resources to support these vulnerable populations. So I didn't realize that at the time, but I was doing design work. I was literally doing design work with EDI at the core, with accessibility at its core. And it wasn't until much later where I was like, oh, that's what I was doing, and that's what I love to do. And then later on, in my current work, I'm designing a program, again with EDI at the center. And what really drives me is that impact. When EDI is at the center, when accessibility is at the forefront, when the community is at the forefront, it's the undeniable impact that actually drives me, and that I love so much.
What do you love about it? Why is it so meaningful? How do you know? I guess maybe a better question is, because we're probably going to go down this rabbit hole of EDI as performative or DEI as initiative tacked on top of something, kind of as an afterthought or as a separate project to being at the core, like you say, of the work. How do you know? What do you look for? What are the indicators that you are centering it and that it is making a meaningful difference and not being performative? I guess we're just going to go right into that question. Like, let's talk about DEI done well at the core, having the desired impact, and DEI done poorly, haphazardly, ad hoc, or however we want to frame the alternative. Mm-hmm.
But I do want to answer your initial question around why. I think that's what you asked.
Yeah, something like that.
It's, again, I think a lot of us come into this space because of lived experience, and a lot of the populations that I'm working on behalf of, I see myself in. I see my mom in. I see my sister in. I see my son in. So there's like almost a personal stake in the work that I do, in the people, the community that I serve, the communities that I serve. Mm-hmm. But jumping right into performative approaches, I spoke with a colleague recently, and she said a few years back, it was truth and reconciliation. Now it's equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think it spoke to almost this unsaid idea that EDI is a trend. It's like hot topics almost. Mm-hmm. And I think that our approaches that we're moving forward with in a lot of different spaces reflect that. This phase in, phase out idea, this check mark, and we probably won't even circle back a year from now. It reflects that the hot topic kind of feeling of it.
Mm-hmm. And what is that it being a trend or a hot topic, what does that have leaders and teams doing? And we'll get to what they should be doing instead. Kind of towards the end, we'll have some insights and some advice on ways to not be performative. But what do you see as the most performative, checkboxy type activities? Like, we can get specific so that leaders, when they see that proposal or when they start thinking about how do I do this, they can clearly avoid this approach. Because sometimes, like you said, it's design work, and design work can be messy. And so we might not know the actual, there is no kind of one way or one path to this, but there's probably some pretty clear, like, hey, that's problematic, or that doesn't do the job that we want it to do. From your perspective, what are some of the top ones that come to mind?
I'm excited, actually, because can I give you an event?
Absolutely.
I find leaders are reactive. And some situations do warrant a reaction, but I think performance at its peak was Blackout Tuesday. Do you remember that?
Yeah, probably, yeah.
Following the death of, or trigger warning, my apologies, following the death of George Floyd, when I think everyone all the businesses on my Instagram posted this Blackout post, and with a lovely caption. I think anti-racist organizations, their donations was at its peak. Everyone was donating. Everyone was kind of talking about it, and it just fizzled out. organizations were talking about anti-racism and Black Lives Matter and never again. But like I think on a more day-to-day basis, we see the one-time workshop that has no preliminary conversation, probably just like a calendar invite, and leaders will say, yeah, it's mandatory, you got to show up, or it's the land acknowledgement without any understanding or general understanding of what decolonization is.
I would love to go one layer deeper.
Let's do it.
Because there's certain topics within workshops, and I'll throw unconscious bias out there as one that was a hot, like everybody was doing unconscious bias training in workshops. And they were, these short kind of webinar style or workshop style. What other topics do you see being kind of at the forefront from a workshop perspective? I'm just thinking if I'm a leader and I'm getting some pressure or some people are advocating for DEI work, which is often, I think, how leaders come to, there's some sort of disruption usually has to happen in a system before a leader or a leadership team will look at it and say, yeah, we need to do something about it. And oftentimes that's people who are within the organization, employees or key partners in the ecosystem saying, hey, you need to do something about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I want a leader to be able to, if they see that proposal come across their desk or that email saying, hey, we should do an unconscious bias training for 2 hours next Tuesday, that'll be a flag for them to be like, wait a minute, I remember Denyelle saying I should do something else instead. What was that thing? And we'll get to that thing. But so I'll put unconscious bias on the table. I know that was a rage for a while, probably still is, lots of that happening, has like, to my knowledge, like zero evaluation that it actually makes a meaningful difference. And in some cases, I think I've seen it pushes things in the wrong direction in some organizations, which is something we don't talk enough about, I think, is how sometimes our interventions actually make things worse, not only in the DEI space, but in the leadership space. I'm going to park that nugget for a little while and go back to my original question. And listeners are used to me asking paragraph-long questions. I did not warn you.
So they're prepared.
They're prepared, but you weren't. So I ask paragraph-long questions. I'm endeavoring to ask shorter, to-the-point questions.
No problem.
What topics do you see being part of that performative workshop approach?
Well, first of all, I hope that I could be the person on their shoulder when they're like, Denyelle said this.
Yeah.
But can I tell you, though, I personally have been in the most unsafe spaces that I've been in have been in academia spaces or in the workplace. And it's because, well, to answer your question, I think the topic or the request for like a workshop that I hear the most is like unpacking power and privilege. So the approach is come to this workshop, this is mandatory, without any sort of conversation. The harm that causes on the vulnerable people, the marginalized people in that room, right? Because now I have to hear my colleague's perspective or stance, and they could be as honestly aggressive as racism doesn't exist. That particular group is just lazy, or they deserved what happened to them, or the different comments. And honestly, those are on the nicer sides. I've been in spaces where it's gotten pretty aggressive and pretty heated, where people are out of their seats, and rightfully so. Like, these are really, really tough conversations to have. But what it does is I now have to go back to sitting across from Jim, and Jim expressed a whole bunch of feelings about people, maybe not necessarily me, but a community that I identify with or that I belong to. And what now? And I find that person now has to experience feeling unsafe. There's distrust. So many different things that, honestly, is irresponsible to facilitate some sort of plan or to have these conversations prior or post. And so to not have an intention to mitigate those risks is irresponsible.
So not necessarily maybe the workshop itself and how it's facilitated and the content, but a lot of the lack of supportive infrastructure or supportive activities to make that meaningful as opposed to potentially harmful is what I'm hearing. So maybe some more intentionality and some thought into the overall experience and how it ties into actual change or systems change as opposed to being a one and done or a checkbox.
And what I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that when we are just trying to check the box, when there's not much intention outside of checking a box, you could actually cause more harm. And I'm going to assume that that's not what we were trying to do. But going back to kind of my approach and my design approach, I always recommend leaders anticipate some level of change management. You're going to have some sort of change management, because going back to what I was saying before, it's a new way of doing things. You're going to have pushback. You're going to have questions, and that's not bad. Just prepare for that process.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I think now is the time. I'm just going to look at our board. We do have a little whiteboard. We've talked to, I'm still infinitely curious about your journey, and so I may pepper you with questions about experiences you've had. But let's look at this DEI conversation and change management and the difference between something actually being designed and delivered to change a system versus an initiative, a project, a checkbox. What should leaders and teams be doing in order to make it the first thing, which is an actual change transformation initiative, versus something we're going to look back on a year or two later, like Blackout Tuesday, and be like, it didn't do much. I did something for a moment and then it was gone, and or to the point of actually that was harmful.
Yeah.
Right. We want to avoid that because I think your assumption about intention impact is accurate. I think that I've never met a leader who wakes up saying, I want to cause harm
Absolutely.
today. And yet we talk to people and harm happens. Harm gets created in our organizations. And so let's focus in a little bit or drill down into, so you want to change culture. You want to transform some of these problematic systems that are marginalizing and oppressing, and how do you do that? How do you do that in a meaningful way? Or what are some tools and frameworks that we can look to?
In my work, I often refer to the onion tool, which is, I actually came across from a local organization here in Calgary called CommunityWise. And it's actually a framework that I literally work from, but the work always starts at the center, which is typically aligning your efforts with your core mission, vision, values. And I always say, if you can't see these efforts aligned in your core mission, vision, and values, that's step number one.
I'm going to interrupt briefly because there's an assumption there that organizations have a fully articulated vision, mission, and values that they can do that work with. And having been in lots of rooms, when I ask, what does that value look like, or what does that mean in practice, and getting a lot of silence, that's an assumption I think that I often am guilty of bringing, is that that's a known thing, that people know that. So what I'm hearing is that might even be work ahead of time before we even start thinking about changing something, of establishing what actually is it that we believe, and is it still true from many years ago when it was maybe established. So apologies for interrupting, but I want to point out that if you can't look at your vision, mission, values and see it, how it might live, that there's probably work to do.
Absolutely.
In that space.
Yeah, if you look at this tool, you'll see that staff capacity building, workshops, you'll see that people and culture, external communications is literally at the end of the process. It's towards the outer layers of the onion. So again, highlighting the importance of change management, because if we're going to be looking at your mission, vision, and values, again, creating that might change so many things. And change is scary. So I'm not trying to scare anyone away. That's not my intention. But big or small, like whether the EDI initiative is, if the choice is to kind of do a workshop, a one-on-one workshop, set out feelers, again, developing some sort of strategy or process that supports that flow is very important. And prepare to contextualize and support how people can bring EDI into their work. Because I find it's okay, unconscious bias, what am I doing with this information? Again, going back to sitting across the gym and pretending like nothing just happened,
Or worse, being asked to empathize with Jim because he's got a bunch of unconscious bias and using that as an excuse for not making changes. I see that kind of, I see it more in the communication space where, something like radical candor becomes just an excuse for Jim, this hypothetical Jim, to just say whatever he wants without worrying about people's feelings or how it lands. And it's used as cover. And I've picked on that particular framework before because I've seen it in action. I've seen leaders who will defend what is arguably quite aggressive or assertive communication that has a bad impact on people, they'll defend that as I'm just speaking my truth. I'm candor. This is just candor, right? And it's actually harmful.
People are just sensitive.
Yeah, and then we tend to blame the people on the receiving end of violence for their response to that violence, as opposed to investigating how is this system perpetuating some of this experience. And so I really appreciate that, and we'll link to the Onion framework on the show notes, and so people can check that out, because I think it is a essential ingredient, is this acknowledgement of what does it take to actually drive change in a system, and it's not done with a workshop, and it's not done with a communications, it's not done by updating your website with some new language, right? There's a lot of bringing people along that journey and designing that. And I know you mentioned design earlier, kind of a shift in your career or recognition that what you do is design. And so maybe I'd love to talk a little bit about design and how that shows up in your work. And when you see design done well, or when you've been proud of design work that you've done with communities in the DEI space. I know you've had some recent experiences with an organization around building a program that really moves the needle. And so we could maybe dig into some of that experience and what went well with that, if that seems like a good rabbit hole to go down. If there's more conversation we want to have about the Onion, we can do that too. So now's the choose your own adventure part of the podcast. What do you want to talk about? What's most alive for you?
Let's talk about, I think when you initially kind of started, I think what sat for me was, I remember very vividly, after graduating, I went into this dark space. Again, the social justice warrior is now graduated and then going into the real world. And I learned, again, studying institutions and systems and policy, that we actually cannot work within almost. Like, it's too far entrenched to design within. It's, again, creating anew. I learned that very, very quickly, and that is why I'm drawn to design, equity design work. But if we want to go into something a little bit more lighter and not my post-social justice warrior.
I would love to explore the post-social justice warrior experience.
Yeah. Sorry, did you actually want to, or did you?
If you're open to it, I'm game. What emerged from that time, or what were some of the things that you were wrestling with that? And I know we're probably off what we had talked about talking about, but we can always edit.
I think first and foremost, it was, I'm in this space where we're pretty all like-minded, like classrooms and things like that, or even my sorority sisters. Like I'm almost in this this space of believing that everybody wants the same thing in terms of systems change. And then I go up against institutions such as healthcare, education, even in the private sector. And I'm like brought down to a very, very harsh reality. Because what I don't want to do is I don't want to make it seem like design work is very, very easy. We are, or if I can say that I go up against systems that have been designed for the past 500 years consistently to tell me that I'm not enough, to tell me that I'm not deserving or worth to be in certain spaces. And society will remind me of that multiple times a day. So that kind of led me into that space of, what did I just commit to? I love this work. I literally don't see myself doing any other work. What do I do? But that is where I kind of preach the importance of community, the importance of having things that you love and things that drive you and things that you value outside of the work that you do. And I think that can go from almost every single profession, because otherwise it could eat so much out of you. And because I see so much of myself in my work, it is very hard work, but it's the impact. It's the impact on the community directly that continue to drive me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think having gone up against some systems earlier in my career, healthcare in particular, and seeing how entrenched and status quo and protective the system is of itself.
It's discouraging.
It's super discouraging, because you can see clearly, because of maybe lived experience or experience with people who are experiencing the services, how better it could be.
Yeah.
And how it's not actually that big of a lift in a lot of circumstances. It's not a huge lift, right? There's certainly some things that we need to just stop doing, but there's some things that with a little bit of design work or a little bit of asking the actual people affected, how they're affected, why they're affected that way, and what could we do better? Like it's pretty basic evaluation and feedback into the system. But you would think. And yet both of us, we talked earlier over breakfast about running into the resistance to that. I learned a new word the other day with a client, of the fear of finding out, which I think is a piece of some leaders don't want to ask the questions because they probably know what those answers are going to be, and they don't want confirmation. They don't want validation that what they're doing is ineffective or that there's something broken in that system.
And I think in my work, I have to be super empathetic and understand what's going on in other people's minds and how they may feel. But imagine that the thing that you've known forever, your entire life, may just be harming others or comes at a cost of others, when that exact thing, you like it a little bit. You know, you enjoy it. It privileges you in different ways. That's a threat to everything you know, and a threat to so many different things in your life. So that's hard. That's also hard. And like you said, that may deter someone from wanting to find out the truth, because that would mean that directly threatens you and what you know and what you're used to.
There's a rabbit hole here about identity and
my gosh,
how much we get attached to our work. I'm guilty of that myself, and how much our system reinforces that perspective and how that shows up into the fragility of power. We could shift gears. Listeners are used to me taking conversations down the rabbit hole of power and how power dynamics explain most of our experiences.
I know.
Maybe we'll go there, but we're not going to go there quite yet, because I had a thought about, being a leader in that intention impact gap tends to be where we spend a lot of time with leaders and teams, is getting really, really clear on what your intentions are, and then asking them, how do you know you're doing that? Like, what do you have concrete evidence from the people that are being impacted that that's the impact that we're having? And to mitigate against that fear of finding out, it's happening anyway. There's a little bit of reality therapy, is that these impacts are happening, whether you know about them or not, and you can't do anything about it if you don't ask the questions. And we'll get pushback sometimes from leaders on some of the questions we ask on our surveys, because we tend to go a layer deeper than a lot of employee engagement surveys, kind of surface level to power dynamics and to conflict and things like that. And we'll occasionally get a leader's like, ooh, I don't really want to ask that question. And part of it for us is setting expectations around. Just because you ask a question doesn't mean you automatically jump to action, right? There's a middle ground there where you co-create and you have a conversation with the people being impacted, and you say, hey, here's some feedback we got. Help us understand how impactable it is and what could be different. And there's a co-piece, let's
Absolutely.
do this with people, as opposed to,
Four.
I think so, as opposed to 4 or 2. Like oftentimes we do things 2 people. And there's a magical thing that happens. And maybe this is a transition in this conversation to co-design and working with people, as opposed to, as a leader, feeling the responsibility of having to have all the answers, having to figure it out, having to design the thing and deliver it and all the stuff. So from your perspective, how do you do collaborative work? How do you do design? How do you do this work in a way that doesn't center the people with power?
I could speak to a project that I'm currently wrapping up right now.
I love that.
Which is very, very exciting project, again, because of that impact. But essentially, I was brought onto the team to design a program that had come out of a lot of evaluation and a lot of consultation with families experiencing food insecurity. So we have all this information, and this particular organization had never worked with families in this capacity. So the intention was, let's pilot this program to A, figure out what is the capacity that we have to support families, and B, what is the impact of food income support on food insecurity. So it was an income support program centered, I guess the models were food and support. It was meant to be co-designed, participant-led, and choice and dignity was at its core. But then it was also a pretty heavy evaluation project as well, because we're trying to learn so much. So when I come in, my approach is, again, going to that EDI framework and grounding the design of a program or a service in those frameworks. So we're working very closely with families right off kind of the cusp, but right off the top. This program needs to be trauma-informed. We're working with families experiencing trauma. It needs to be trauma-informed. And that looks like acknowledging how trauma shows up in someone's life, acknowledging that, hey, we're going to be building trust, and we're going to be spending a lot of time together. So some trauma may come up. How can we mitigate that, right? And then the second one was this co-design element, destabilizing the traditional, often nonprofit mindset of beggars can't be choosers, or we are the experts and you should be grateful for whatever we provide you with. Mm-hmm. So destabilizing that and actually centering folks with lived experience as the experts in that space. And how we lived in that was that we created an advisory council that actually helped us design prior and during that program, but they were paid. The same way how when we identify a gap in an organization and we're like, hey, we need to bring in a consultant or we need to hire a person, that person is paid because of the expertise they offer. It's the same exact process. And then lastly, community development, because we have to acknowledge that we are not the end-all, be-all. Poverty is a very big problem with many different players and intersecting factors. So one income support project is not going to solve everything. So prioritizing working with the community, working with other organizations to be able to, again, go back to that trauma-informed framework and mitigating the risks and harms and supporting them outside of food support if they need it. So 1-year program, providing grocery cards on a monthly basis, and work with me here because this is kind of complicated, but we provide $150 in grocery cards per child aged K to 12, up to a max of 3 children. So we have some families who are receiving $150 and other families who are receiving $450. And it is an extremely low barrier program. It is a closed program, and we're supporting 50 families. I don't know if I've already mentioned that. But I think what to take away from that was the evaluation methods that we use. So we have we have monthly surveys, and you, as an evaluator, know surveys. But I'm proud to say we get 100% responses every single month. And it's because of that reciprocal component where we let the participants know, hey, this is really data intensive and we need this data to be able to generate the impact. Mm-hmm. So so 100%, letting them know right off the top. And we are able, from that monthly survey, to track so many different things. We're able to track stress, food insecurity. We have scales to track all that stuff. And again, that's going back to that initial question around what is the impact of food support on food insecurity. But we're able to track also dignity and stories around choice and all that good stuff. And then the impact, I think the largest impact has been unintended, because through that program, we've been able to, again, bringing these EDI principles that are completely new to the organization, we have been able to essentially change the strategic direction of the organizations. Whereas before, donors and volunteers were explicitly named in the strategic plans of the organization, we now have families named in the theory of change, in our KPIs, in every area of the organization, in their logic models. It's families who are now guiding the work. Mm-hmm. And it was really tough to navigate this and to push for it. There was a level of change management that had to go into it. There's a level of capacity building and learning that had to go into it. But it's the undeniable impact that we've been able to see and to be able to track as well. The families that we work with are so engaged. They are so engaged, not only with us as the organization, but also with each other. And as we know, community is important, especially when experiencing things like food insecurity. So those are, again, another unintended impact, which is huge. Yeah.
And so much in there. And what were some of the key barriers or key challenges in that shift into actually centering I'll say client voice, but family voice or person served? Because I think a lot of, especially in the nonprofit space, but all over healthcare, education, governance, and business, people want to center the needs of the people they're there to serve. And they say that they do. And then you talk to people being served and they're like, I don't feel centered in this. And so what were some of those key barriers or decisions that you and the team made, aside from what you've named already, which is having an advisory council, doing really robust evaluation? I think those are two great ingredients in any of this. But you mentioned change management. So what are some of those things to watch for as a leader as you're pushing to make transformational change that you are going to run into? And maybe we can then talk about how to mitigate some of those or ways around them.
I think this situation, this case is unique in a sense where it was a team dedicated to this project. So when we had the capacity to react and respond, we get 50 surveys a month, and not all the time folks are happy, or they're going through things, or things come up that we had the capacity to respond to. And because we responded in a way that was dignified, in a way that was trauma-informed, the trust was built almost automatically. Well, I won't say automatically, but it definitely was formed, and you could see it. The change management pieces, I think the hardest part was staff buy-in. And I remember mentioning to you over breakfast, the hard part about this work is that most of the families that we work with, like I see myself in, very similar experiences. Most of the families, over 50% of the families come from single mother households, right? That right there. I also come from a single mother household. So to now convince, a group of people why we should be prioritizing, why we should be offering choice, when it's going back to that mentality of, well, they're just going to double dip, or they're just lazy, or whatever those common, understandings of certain groups of people are, it's hard to kind of separate. And that's the hardest piece, because again, it feels like it's convincing why my life matters, why my mom's life matters, or her experience matters, and how this is not something that it's a systems problem rather than a person problem. So
in a system that likes to make everything an individual's problem, right? There's so much systemic pressure to view everything at the level of the individual that it's no wonder that sometimes we feel like we're being personally attacked in the DEI conversations. As a cisgendered white male, it would be very easy for me to get my back up at the number of times we run into a cisgendered white male, but it's actually not aimed at me, right? Like I'm in that group. And yet if we individualize the conversation, we go nowhere, right? We have to be able to tackle it at a systemic level. And so let's maybe shift gears a little bit into systems level change. What are some of the levers that you can pull? What are some ways that you've seen systems actually make meaningful change outside of the program that you're describing? We could talk a little bit about mindset too, and how to shift paradigms and mindsets and values. You alluded to that with the team around having to say, like, actually that narrative that you have about that group or that issue is not true. Like, it's not accurate. It's a perception. And we actually don't know what it's like to be a Black single woman raising kids in food insecurity unless we are that person, right? Or have lived that experience. Another long-winded question from me, but let's talk a little bit about systems levers. What are some of those things that we can look at and be like, oh, if we change that, it's going to have an impact?
I feel like if we want to speak to leadership, I think, again, going off that view of how we view people, or how we view team members or employees specifically, primarily as workers and not people who have other experiences or other values outside of their productivity or their output. Our teams are so much more than that. they wear so many hats that shape their experiences. They have identities that go far beyond your organization or an organization. But I think looking at, are those things valued and how? Because if you're going to see me, again, you're going to see that I am a Black young woman who's also a mother and a wife, and that impacts how I show up for work every single day. Actually, in my first conversation I had with Pablo, he acknowledged that right off the top. Like right off the, hi, my name is Pablo, and I see you. But that conversation was that intro to him was incredibly meaningful. Because again, if you see me, you see that. And I think the impact on, and I'll speak in terms of people of color or folks living with disabilities or other vulnerable communities, it impacts how a person is able to access a space or thrive in a space. And then we see how that manifests. If you're unable to see that, then it manifests in those things that you guys often talk about in terms of chronic burnout, disengagement, cultural disconnection, unhealthy conflict, and the list goes on and on and on.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. I'm thinking back to, we did some work in the addiction and mental health is my background, and we reevaluated our values and operationalized them at a certain point in the journey when we realized that they weren't giving us the guidance we needed, they weren't concrete enough. And the very first value that we identified is we see whole people. That was what the system doesn't do. Most systems don't see whole people, mm-hmm. like you said. They see pieces of the people that they want to see. They want to see the productive side of you. That's what they're going to center. Seeing a whole person is liberating and challenging. I get the challenge behind it. I'm guilty of not seeing whole people. I've got 3 kids. I don't always see all of them. Having some mechanism to remind us and to help us center the actual needs and values of the people that we're working with, I think is a great first starting point. I actually can't think of a better starting point than the acknowledgement, back to that maybe duality, is that we are more than just the thing that has us in this relationship, mm-hmm. in this moment.
Mm-hmm. And I think that you as Ally Co, from my experience, you guys really live within that, especially in the surveys, right? Asking those layered questions, and then you may have a few leaders, because I know some leaders struggle with, well, why do we need to ask them? Why? Motherhood has no place in the workplace.
Except I did a workshop a couple of years ago, and we did a little self-care, how you doing on a burnout, just a really quick assessment. Mm-hmm. All the working mothers were doing very poorly. Mm-hmm. All the white men with power were doing much better. Of course. It's oh, this is interesting. We're not all having the same experience with self-care and burnout, and that's the intention, right? Is to see, again, to highlight the fact that we're having different experiences. That means we have different needs. That means a one-size-fits-all approach, and that policy actually needs to be revisited to become more flexible.
Going back to equality versus equity.
Yeah.
Equality is that one-size-fits-all approach that is inherently inaccessible, mm-hmm. while equality is fairness. It's rooted in fairness. It's rooted in accessibility. What may be accessible to a group of working moms is probably not going to be what's accessible to a group of single men.
Yeah. And we're seeing a lot of that conversation play out with the return to the office mandates and the work from home debate, is that, mm-hmm. That duality and that different experiences and different needs are very much in the forefront for a lot of leaders, mm-hmm. in the conversation. So, awesome. Yeah. One thing that I try and foreground, or I'm conscious of, mm-hmm. is the gap between theory and practice, between conceptual understanding. I get that that's a thing. Mm-hmm. What do I do about it on the ground as a leader? I struggle with that in my parenting. I've got visions for how I want to be as a parent, and then there's how Jeff actually shows up some days, and it's there's a gap there, and I do not always know how to close it. Mm-hmm. And so for the well-intentioned leader, for the person listening to this, nodding their head, saying, yes, equity, mm-hmm. that's what I want to center. And I don't always know how to start or where to start. And we've identified the kind of mindset and the recognition that people are more than what we see, that they're whole people. And we should be curious. I think curiosity is maybe a leadership value or trait that I try and instill, is just to be genuinely curious. Not curious for the sake of reinforcing or validating your opinion, but just genuinely curious about someone. How do you do that? Or how do you, and maybe this will get us into some of the design work that you do, or some of the practices of doing this work. Not just wanting to do the work, but like, let's get into it. What are some of the skill sets, tools, things that you've seen be effective?
I really, in terms of leadership and how I would call my leadership, it would probably be an empathetic leader. Just the ability to be able to understand the perspective and the needs of others, right? I don't need to be a working dad of three to understand the different complexities or the different challenges that you face being a working dad of three. And I think this is how we begin to live in that value of accessibility, is understanding. And I would say 2 would be aiming to ensure relationships are reciprocal. I find that's like, if we look at the root cause of burnout, it's because a lot of folks are feeling like we're giving so much more than we're getting back. And so, again, bringing up that word of sustainability, looking at equitable pay is probably high in the list, but what about support? Offering support, being there, like available to support, especially as a leader, feeling valued. I don't know have you ever heard of not workplace love languages, but appreciation at work. I call it workplace love language. But appreciation at work, like those things go very, very far in people feeling valued. And people deserve to have their needs met too. And also to be able to have the space and empowerment to be able to voice those needs. I'm at 2. 3, I would say the third thing would probably be building relationships rooted in trust, with being leading with empathy and your team member feeling valued, and then also adding in that level of trust. They're going to soar. They're going to soar. And then the last thing I would say as a leader, to kind of how they can incorporate equity into their styles of leadership, the last thing would probably be to acknowledge, validate, and prioritize the change work.
Yeah. Centering the desired impact and holding tightly to that, and maybe loosening our grip on some of the standard ways of doing business. And the default is like an easy button for leaders. I've been guilty of this before, to just point at a policy and say, sorry, that's the policy. I don't have to have this type of deep conversation, or I don't have to acknowledge that it's not working. I can just point to it and say,
that's what it is.
That's what it is. I love that. And I think, this conversation, I feel like we did a follow-up round 2 here, where we're going to dig into power and power dynamics and how power shows up in the workplace. That's a lot of the work that we do, and I'd love to get your perspective on power dynamics and how to navigate them, because it's a very nuanced thing, but it also, I can't look at human behavior and dynamics without saying, well, there's power. Like, you have a certain amount of power and it's rooted in something, and I have a certain amount of power. It's like it's here in the room with us. I don't have a human relationship that isn't part of a power dynamic. It's obvious with my kids when they push back on what they want to eat for dinner, and I say, no, I'm cooking X, that dad's using his power a certain way to get a certain outcome. But it can become more nuanced in the workplace, and a lot of different factors at play. But I think that's a big enough conversation that we can park that, and we can either have it over breakfast, or we can have a round 2 on the podcast. What haven't we talked about today that you were hoping we would, or something that you want to explore a little bit before we let the listener get back on with their day, or maybe they've made it to the office already, they're done their commute?
Something that... is DEI an initiative?
Oh, we never really answered that question, did we?
I hope I did.
I think so. I hope people can read between the lines and be like, I think it's more than just a one-off initiative or a project.
And if there was one thing that we take from this episode, I hope that we answered that it's not. Mm-hmm. That it requires a deep level of intention, and almost risk mitigation, and buy-in.
Yeah, it requires that change management, and it's interesting because absolutely DEI needs change management, but so does leadership training and development, and so does a lot of the other initiatives that get undertaken as checkbox things. Basically, I think maybe a take-home, if you zoom out from this conversation, is performative checkbox things that end up just perpetuating the status quo or moving us in the other direction, versus things that are very intentional about the impact they're trying to create for who, paired with change management, paired with the type of resources and support and buy-in, like you said, that they need to actually make that difference. I think that's what a lot of organizations and leaders struggle with. And I was in a room with a group of senior leaders just yesterday, and we were talking about this very phenomenon. And they acknowledge that they don't want this to be a thing that the organization looks back on 20 years from now and says, oh yeah, we did a thing in 2023. And it either didn't go anywhere, or it didn't change, it didn't evolve, it didn't kind of implement or integrate into the system. And so I think most leaders know that. We've all experienced the checkbox approaches, and we all know that they don't work, and yet for some reason we find ourselves doing them. And so there's something deeper there, I think, that we need to explore. And I think some of that comes back to a point that was made earlier about vision, mission, values not being clear and articulated enough to serve as real guideposts for the work that we do. And in the absence of that, we'll center either what we've always centered, or our needs as individuals, or profit, or something else that is not the thing that we should center.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's something there about the checkbox approach that almost like deflects accountability. Because if we do a workshop on unconscious bias, I'm telling you that you have a bias problem, and the accountability now is inflicted on you rather than the accountability being on, or the focus being on the culture or the root or the lack of the core mission, vision, values. So
it's the system's way of saying, hey, look over there. There's the problem.
And that is
mislocating the problem. Yeah.
And that sometimes can be intentional. If we look at history, that's a whole different conversation.
Yeah, but intentional or not has an impact. And that's our conversations often with leadership teams. Is it like good intentions, we assume them, but we have to be held accountable for the impact that we have. We could have it in. There's a couple podcasts here about a couple of different ways to explore. These are big topics, and I, for one, really appreciate you taking the time out to have this conversation with me and to share your insights and your wisdom and your lived experience with the listener. And I know they appreciate it as well. We will have links to some of the things that we talked about in the show notes. The Onion, for sure. I've been digging into that model, and I'm sure I'll be using that moving forward, as well as where to find you on various places. I don't know if there's if you're on the social medias, the LinkedIn and the different places, but we'll have links where people can find you, because shortly you are available to do this work with organizations and leadership teams. And so this is a call out to anyone listening who is looking at their DEI initiative and wanting to take it from initiative to deep transformational work. Denyelle is available, and you should definitely get in touch with her. So
thank you for that.
No, thank you. I appreciate it, and I look forward to our next podcast conversation. So
absolutely.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.